and recording. So we are now recording. So I'm going to be covering as much of the inventory module as I can today. We're going to start off with just talking about inventory records in general and their standard features. We're going to talk about service scheduling and service scheduling notifications. We'll talk briefly about equipment usage. We'll also talk about how to track inventory expiry, expected life and notifications, manufacturing date, and then a body of reports around that kind of stuff. We'll talk about tracking your apparatus and how to track driving, mileage, incident histories, stuff like that. We'll also talk about linking inventory items to personnel records, how to unassign them, and some standard features there, as well as our warranty reminders option if you wanted to get notifications on inventory warranties. So we are going to start off within a demo FirePro system and pop into the inventory module. The first thing I want to talk about today is going to deal mostly with the standard features of inventory records. So these are kind of things that almost all inventory items have in common and can really help you out on the organizational side of things. So if we create a new inventory item, what we're going to see up at the top is that each inventory item can be assigned to a category, and those categories can have subcategories attached to them, potentially. Let's find one that does have subcategories. So usually it's not mandatory for an inventory item to have a subcategory, but subcategories do a number of really useful things for you, primarily in terms of things like service scheduling and tracking service logs. So if you have an option to put in, or if you want to put in a subcategory, it's usually a good idea, especially for serviceable inventory items. For certain items, you can just put in as no subcategory, but you give away some useful information. There is also the ability to assign inventory items to a specific station. So in some cases, that's going to be physically where the item is, or in the case of apparatuses, where the item responds from. In some cases, if you're dealing with, for example, chief's vehicles as relates to apparatuses, you're probably going to want to set them as any station, which indicates that they could be involved in responses from any individual station that they might be responding to. But normally, we're going to be identifying what station this particular piece of equipment is at, and we can also have an associated location. When we're dealing with location, it's really important to think about how easy it's going to be to keep track of this location, because some pieces of equipment will float around, either within the hall or potentially within the department. So I will often like to have just a straight station location assignment. And this is most useful for pieces of gear that aren't going to be necessarily in a reliable place or a consistent place. I also personally find that it's kind of best practice from a location perspective to have a personnel or an assigned to personnel location. This allows you to easily indicate on an individual inventory item, is this piece of gear currently assigned to a person and therefore maybe not in the fire department? And when that person returns that gear, you can easily toggle the equipment from personnel to, say, station, or potentially some departments will have an additional location along the lines of storage or in storage. That also gives you the ability to do some quick searching if you wanted to, say, pull up information about show me gear that is at a particular station and show me gear that is assigned to a particular location, for example. So that function allows you to relatively quickly find stuff based on station and physical location. If you're wanting to quickly toggle between, hey, let's find stuff that's assigned to my personnel versus stuff that might be assigned to storage, so that you can see what you've got in storage there. So having locations which indicate this gear is assigned to a person versus this gear is in storage can be really helpful. Likewise with location, Normally, you would also have many apparatuses assigned to your locations. It is important to remember when we're dealing with inventory in general that you want to think kind of carefully about what sort of gear you want to have in the inventory module. A lot of departments by reflex will add all the gear that they have on their truck checklists to the inventory module, but that's not always the most efficient use of your time because some gear doesn't provide you with a lot of additional information when entered into the inventory module. So it's useful to think about what you want your inventory module to do for you in order to determine what pieces of gear you want to be entering into the inventory module. The more stuff that you add to inventory, the more time and effort it takes on an ongoing basis to keep that information up to date. So it can be a useful way to maintain your personal sanity to just go ahead and try to keep your inventory records limited to things that you specifically want to make sure you're tracking information. And normally that comes down to things like apparatuses as a primary. A lot of departments, that's one of their main things that they're tracking in here. A lot of departments will also include things like bunker gear, SCBA equipment, things that require regular and ongoing servicing can be very good candidates for tracking in inventory. If you're currently maintaining a spreadsheet about it, it's usually a good candidate for the inventory module. However, there's a lot of stuff on your truck charts, Halligan tools, screwdrivers, that might not be as useful to have in the inventory module versus the amount of time that they take to put in. So it's usually nice to think a bit about what classes of item you want to have in here. So each inventory item is also going to have a different labeled item name, essentially, is what this field is. You can change the label on this particular field. So, sometimes it is item name, sometimes it's item. This is going to usually be your standard description of the piece of equipment. And what I like to do a lot of the time is actually make sure that I'm putting something that's quite descriptive in here, as opposed to something like just serial number, for example. There's a lot of reports associated with inventory, as well as reminders and notifications that FirePro can give you, and having something reasonably descriptive in the item name field can make it a lot easier to identify what you're being notified about. There are up to 4 different serial number fields associated with each inventory item. So there's lots of places to put serial number. If we're putting something in the description, this is normally going to be more along the lines of, say, if you have a new member of the fire department and you want them to go get something for you, how would you describe that piece of equipment? That tends to be a good item for putting in the description of the piece of gear. It can also be really helpful if you have a piece of gear and you've got it assigned to a person. And we'll talk about this a little more when we talk about actual assigning inventory to people, but putting their initials or their ID number in the description of a piece of gear can be a really convenient way to cross-check or quickly identify from a list what piece of equipment and whose piece of equipment we are looking at here. So putting stuff like that in can also be quite useful. We do have areas in these records, specifically in the notes section. Oh, are we not seeing the modules? That would be embarrassing. Let's talk about that. My apologies. Apparently I needed 2 cups of coffee this morning. Okay, so quickly reviewing, looking at the inventory records that I have been working on for this entire time. The category section and subcategory that we talked about. We've got the station lists. Yes, thank you. If it appears that I'm doing something weird, please let me know. Likewise, if my sound cuts out, that's handy to know as well. So we can see description, unit information here. So yeah, when we're dealing with different classes of item, the linking type is also a really important piece of information. So most inventory items, if you've just got them in the system for the purpose of tracking things like servicing, expiry dates, stuff like that, those pieces of equipment will normally go in with the linking type of not linked. That means these just exist in the inventory module, and they're only there for that purpose. If we look at the apparatus linking type, this indicates that a piece of equipment is a vehicle of some kind. And that's going to have several different results and ramifications on it. So assigning something to the linking type of apparatus is going to, first of all, give you some additional informational fields on the record, like make, model, and VIN number. It will also add a defects tab, or sorry, a mileage tab, where you can, if you want to, track the dates, the odometer readings, and the liters of the fill and the cost, which will automatically over time start to calculate mileage information for you if that's useful to you. It will also give you an incidents tab, which is going to show you all the different incidents that this particular apparatus has responded to. So we'd be able to see the specific dates, the incident reference numbers, and information. And that will just all populate automatically from the incident records as you build these out. But flagging something as an apparatus is required to add anything to the truck chart. Dropping something in as an apparatus also allows you to do things like track driving and link it to CAD imports. We'll touch on that a little further down the line. We also have the ability to link particular pieces of equipment to incidents, PubEd, or properties. So this basically allows you to log on these different kinds of modules exactly when this piece of equipment was used. Incidents is a common one. This is normally something that I only recommend for departments if this is kind of something they're already tracking. It's an additional piece of information that you need to have people filling out on scene, which can be extra time and effort there. But using this linking function does allow you to quickly generate a list of all the different types of activities or incidents where this piece of gear was used. Often it can be useful for bigger ticket, more complicated items like AEDs, lifting bags, say extrication gear, things where it can be really useful to have a detailed log of all the times that you used it. And I'll quickly show you on the actual incident modules where those things can come from. So there's also the link to personnel option. We'll talk about this in a minute when we deal with how you attach inventory items directly to personnel records. So this can be a really handy tool for tracking all the gear that's assigned to an individual, keeping track of it when you need it back, or getting reminders that gear that you've loaned out is due back. There is also on every inventory record a notes tab where we have a section for description and specifications. I do see a lot of times people putting a bunch of information in the description or the item name here, where it might make more sense to put it in the description or specifications. This is fairly flexible. That way you don't need to have a bunch of custom fields specifically for pieces of info about this gear. You can just drop it in here and this can print out on standard reports. Hi, Rose. You have a question, it looks like.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so in my Fire Pro, I have in the inventory module, I have an apparatus record pulled up, and in the linking type, I have apparatus selected.
Yep.
So when I go to the incident tab, just similar to what you just did, there's no incidences listed there.
Do you have a date range search parameter down at the bottom?
That might do it. It says this month, so you're right. So that's if I went to year to date.
So if you switch that search date range search parameter and you want to keep it that way for good, you
Yes.
can right click anywhere on the tan, like not on the blue section, and select set default.
Reset to default.
Yeah, set to no. You want to do. That's odd. I will make a note. We will add, there's usually a save as my list template or a set default search option in most Windows. So I'll add that so you can keep that search function up. That just didn't happen in the inventory module for whatever reason. But changing that date range would allow you to see historical incidents attached to that piece of gear.
Okay, so let me just check to see here. So I'll pull up the rescue that I know we use quite a bit, right? So, and if I go to this year to date, okay, I see it now. Okay, so if we have an apparatus, do we automatically want to link it to the apparatus linking type?
Yeah, that's really essential because then you can assign it to incidents where it's attached. You can link it to the CAD imports. You can track driving on it. So you always want to make sure that every apparatus item, like category, sometimes is entered as apparatus. Some departments enter it as trucks. But you always want to make sure that if it's drivable, it has a linking type of apparatus.
Okay, so then if it's equipment, that's something more where we would want to link it to personnel, or if it was going to just something that stayed in the hall that was non-mobile, then we would just do not linked.
Yeah, so a lot of equipment, like if a piece of gear is on an apparatus, it doesn't have a linking type of apparatus. It's usually not linked and then assigned to an apparatus location.
Okay.
Whereas apparatus generally means this piece of gear has, we can drive this thing around is kind of what that means.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. That kind of clarification is helpful for why we're here. So when you do flag a piece of gear as an apparatus, you're going to get a bunch of additional information. If you flag a piece of gear as assignable to personnel, you will get some different information. The assigned to tab specifically, this is actually going to allow you right from the assigned to tab to attach a piece of gear to a personnel record. And you can also do this same process from the individual personnel record. I'll walk through that process a little bit more when we talk more about linking gear to personnel. So with the basic information related to an inventory item, what we also will often see is information like quantity of item, purchase date, and purchase cost. This information can be really useful if you're trying to track things like your estimated inventory values or your inventory replacement information. So I'm going to get into that in a little more detail when we get a little further down the line. You do also have a couple of reports that are generic reports that are built into the FirePro system. On the printer icon on the right-hand side, we have an inventory quantity report. This can be a really handy report if you quickly want to spit out how much of either certain classes or all types of gear you have. So I can say, break me down inventory quantities by location, for example. I could also break this out by subcategories. So if I want to look at different types of gear, but in this case, I can get a quick printed report, which would show me all the stuff which I might expect to find in this case in the office, in the bunker room, lots of different information here. And as usual, these reports are all going to be generated from whatever you have in your search function. So you can filter down, for example, to a particular station first, and then generate an inventory quantity by location report, for example. There is also a report in here, which is our inventory labels report. Some departments like to use barcode scanners or ID labels on their gear. If you want to do that, you can actually get standardized labels and print them out right away using the inventory labels report. This will generate UTF-128 barcodes for the selected inventory items. we can also use serial numbers from barcodes in the actual serial number fields here if you want to create some linking. We can talk about that whole options for barcoding at some other time, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of that inventory labels report. Now, most of the time, a lot of the gear that is going to be assigned to the inventory module is going to have servicing outlines and servicing requirements on it. This tends to be the type of gear that I recommend as really high priority or really high quality for having in the inventory module. So in order to set up servicing schedules, those servicing schedules are built at the subcategory level. So if I edit the subcategory list, I can see I have my protective clothing subcategory here, and down at the bottom, I have some options. So one is I can set default linking for this subcategory. So for example, if I create an apparatus subcategory for engines, I can just say default linking is apparatus. That means any inventory item I assign to this subcategory will automatically get linked as an apparatus. This also works retroactively. So for example, if you have a bunch of bunker gear in the system that's not currently flagged as linked to personnel, I can go in and say, well, this is actually something that should be linked to personnel. And if I save it, it will update the linking type for all those existing inventory items for you as a quick way of filling that stuff out. But after the default linking, we have the service schedule and the service types buttons down at the bottom. So broadly speaking, when we're dealing with servicing notifications and servicing information in FirePro, service schedule indicates when is this piece of gear due for its next servicing, and service records or service types are used to log what servicing has actually been done on this thing. So, and we can link those two together in various different ways. So if I click on the service schedule button in the bottom left-hand corner here, I can see I have a service schedule options for, in this case, my bunker boots. Now, what I just might want to do here is have an annual gear check notification for servicing. So I would create a new service schedule, call it equipment check. Identify that I want this to happen every 12 months and give myself 1 month, but I could do other time periods of advance notice. So when I look at a specific inventory item now that's in that category, find some bunker boots. Probably should have checked to see that those exist, but let's go real quick and put one in clothing, bunker boots. So as soon as I identify this subcategory for this item, we're going to get our service schedule appearing on it. With service scheduling, each individual inventory item can have its own date for last service. If you leave the last service date blank, it will never generate a reminder or a notification for that particular piece of gear. It'll more or less ignore it. But as soon as I put in a date that we last did this servicing, the system's going to generate a service due date for you for that piece of gear. Test gear. Oops. So this is now going to generate a servicing reminder for you in the reminders module. That's the default place it appears, but I'll show you some other places it's also going to show up. So the first thing that's going to happen is I could generate reminders, and I get notifications on when servicing reminders are due for me as far as various different pieces of gear. Inventory item expiry reminders, and servicing notifications. So service due, for example, here is going to show me that there is a scheduled service for this date for this item. So
Jeremy,
yes, go ahead.
So when you're doing that, are you attaching the reminder to the subcategory or to each individual one? And if not, like, is there a way of doing it to multiple?
So what happens here is that the The subcategory determines the type of servicing that can happen for this item, but each individual item will have its own date and service reminder for that class of service schedule. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So if you want to do a batch update for, and this is one of the next things to talk about, say, for example, you are doing servicing, say, hydrostatic testing on a number of inventory items. The simplest way to log that is to go into the inventory module, go to the red toolbox, and select the update service information for many inventory items tool. This is a batch servicing update tool. So what I can do here is filter by type of item that I want. And then, well, in this case, if we use the bunker or let's see, breathing air, cylinders and air. So say, for example, we're doing hydrostatic testing on a number of cylinders. I can search for items to update based on category and subcategory. I can also filter these by specific location. So if I wanted to say, I'm only doing this at station 1, or in this case, I'll do any location, but it's going to let me see the item name and the serial number 1 field for all those pieces of equipment that match this search. And then I can double click on an item to put it in the list of items to update, or I can hold down Control, pick a bunch of items and hit Add to List, or I can hold down Shift to grab a chunk and also hit Add to List. What happens then is that I can determine which of the service schedules I want to update for this gear, and I can do both at the same time if I want, but we want to remember that this is going to update this information on all the selected pieces of equipment. So I could say, all right, we did hydrostatic testing on those items today. It will generate a new service due date for all these. I could also add my service record logs at the same time here. So put in my service record. I can quickly edit and put in that this is hydrostatic testing, and I'll explain this tool in just a second. So I can say, okay, this was hydrostatic testing that we did, and we did it on this date as well, same date. I can, as part of this service record entry, put in cost for particular per item cost for things like hydrostatic testing, and I can put in individual comments. There is also the ability through these service logs to retire a group of items if you want to do that while you're doing the service logs, and especially if you've got to say a dozen pieces of hose that you want to retire because they failed hose testing or something like that. Just doing it in batch like this can be a good way to do that. So as soon as I save this, it's going to update the service dates on every one of these pieces of gear. It's going to put in a hydrostatic testing service log, so I get that updated information on every single piece of equipment that I've put in. So if I go in and look at my breathing air categories, and I can now see on these, I have an updated service due date because it identified that the item had been serviced, and I have a service record entered for this date. So this allows me to really quickly put in these service logs. So that option is in the red toolbox at the top of inventory. Update service information for many inventory items. Really, really handy tool for putting this stuff in. So when I look at my service schedule, normally I'm going to have several different types of scheduled service for a lot of these types of equipment. What I'm also going to have is different types of servicing records on here. And in many cases, the servicing records are going to be consistent with the service schedules. For example, hydrostatic testing is a scheduled service, and one of the service record types is hydrostatic testing. But in many cases, it's not necessarily. There can be other servicing that you might do that is not scheduled. A good example of that would be post-use servicing on your packs and SCBA bottles. So that's you can have other types of service records in the service record list. Yes. perfect. Inventory item, red toolbox, yeah. We normally call that guy the action menu, but red toolbox is a more accurate description. So when I am setting up my service schedules, I normally like to try to set up my service types at the same time. And this can be done through the other button here with service types. So in many cases, like with cylinders, a hydrostatic testing is a service type that we want to build that's consistent with our service schedule. And we can see down here, I've linked this service schedule type directly to the actual scheduled service. So what this means is that if I go in here now on this inventory item, and I just put in a service record, say for the 6th now, and that's hydrostatic testing. I don't normally recommend one-offs, but there's plenty of times when there's just a single servicing that gets done. But as soon as I attach that, because I linked this service record and service type to the schedule, it'll update the schedule for me automatically. So we can see this has been updated to the new date based on the service record that you entered. So that can be really convenient to just keep the servicing up to date. But in many cases, there's other servicing that I'm going to do that isn't necessarily linked to the service schedules. So for cylinders, for example, I know that I do post-use servicing a lot. And so I can just put in a post-use service type. It is not linked to any schedule because it just happens after you use it. But this then becomes an option where if you are quickly logging post-use servicing, I can go into my red toolbox and say, all right, we are doing cylinders and this type of cylinder, and I can grab a bunch, add to list, and just put in straight service records for post-use service. These were the ones we did. It'll log that information, put in the officer in charge, and now we have updated service logs for all those pieces of equipment that we just did servicing after usage, which again can be useful information as we get further down the line and start to develop a detailed history of service records. Those can also come, if you want to, with things like service cost. If you're documenting estimated cost for service, this is going to populate a couple of useful things for you in terms of, I can then run a service cost report and say, how much did we spend in the last 36 months on servicing our, in this case, cylinders, because that's what I've got on the search. Here we go. This is the items we've serviced. This is how much we spent on it. Sometimes these reports are depressing, but sometimes they're also useful. So if you log that kind of stuff, you can get some useful reports. Another really useful report that goes hand in hand with the scheduled servicing is the service schedule report. So I can search for different types of inventory, or I can search for, say, specific stations. And then in this case, I'll say all categories that are assigned to that station. And then I can run a scheduled service report. This report is going to ask me for a date range. So often I'm going to be running this report for the future. Right? Show me all the inventory servicing that's due next month or next quarter. In this case, I can say this year, just so we have a longer date range. But that is going to generate for me, let's go with a longer time period. So it's going to generate for me a scheduled service report, which is going to break down your items by category and subcategory, and then show you each individual servicing type and which items need servicing, as well as when it was due and how much that piece of gear cost. So we can see we've got reminders for hydrostatic testing for a set of items, O-ring replacement, flow testing for packs and regulators, and we're going to generate a pretty robust report. This can be something that's really handy to run, say, in advance of a monthly officers meeting or something like that, so you have this information about servicing that needs to get done in the near future. These notifications are all also going to flow into your reminders module, so you can filter in reminders for this case, we can do inventory service record reminders. You can then filter those inventory service reminders by specific categories if you want, or subcategories. And these search functions can be saved as part of an individual user's standard reminder profile. You can also set FirePro up to email these inventory servicing reminders to specific people if that's something that you want to do. I tend not to do that by default because I don't necessarily want to be a source of spam and stress, but it is possible if you want to do it. So this is another way to get those same servicing notifications, but it can be a nice targeted way to do it is to run a scheduled service. So service scheduling is usually a pretty high priority and allows you to build custom service schedules for different classes of item, have individualized servicing dates for each piece of gear, and create a pretty detailed servicing history for each individual item. And that can include repairs as well. Sometimes I like to use the defects module for repairs, but we'll talk about that possibly at some other training. Okay, so another type of usage report or action report is the ability to assign specific pieces of gear. I'm just going to cover this relatively briefly. In some cases, for example, departments want to track that an individual piece of equipment has been used at an incident, at a public education session, on a daily log report. So setting something to this incidents pub ed properties linking type is actually going to allow you to attach this class of gear to various other places in the program. Most commonly, that's something like incident reports, where I can pull up an incident report and I have a tab on here for inventory usage. So I can add new inventory usage. It is going to show me all my equipment that is flagged as being usable at incidents. I can just select that. And if I want to put in usage costs, I can do that. So that's going to create for me, no, I do not. I think the OFC does not need to know about that. I can then see on an individual item a history of all the incidents that this particular piece of gear has been used at, or public education events, or any other type of usage. Consumables do work that way. They're very similar to that, but actually a little more detailed in terms of tracking exactly how many you have on hand. All consumable items are automatically flagged to be used at all different types of activities, and the system will then actively keep track of how many you have used and how many you have on hand. I'd probably like to do actually a detailed one like this on consumables specifically, because they are a little more detailed than a standard inventory record. So what you can then do there is see a history of usage there. There is also an associated report to that. So if I go into inventory, I can generate a equipment used report. I can pick whatever kind of date ranges I want, and the system is then going to spit out a report for me that shows when particular pieces of equipment were used. This is going to have to go through quite a few records, so let me just take a second, but it's going to show you exactly what pieces of equipment were used at each individual location, or each individual incident, or each individual training session. There's lots of different ways you can log usage if you want to do that. Again, that is an extra step in the incident reporting process, though. So I picked too many items and a lot of date ranges. So in this case, we can just quickly see this is how many times this particular piece of gear was used and when. And this will break things down by category and subcategory as well. So again, useful option potential. Now, another thing that all inventory items have available for them is an automatic calculation of expiry date. You can put in expiry date manually if you want to, but normally if you want to have a calculated expiry date, all you have to do is put in an expected life in the expected life field, and either a purchase date or a manufactured date. The system will use purchase date if you don't have a manufactured date entered. If you do, then it will use manufactured date, and it will automatically generate an expiry date for you. So we can see expected life is going to set, well, if you don't have an expiry date already, it will set you an expiry date notification. The expiry date is going to generate a reminder, just like the service schedule notifications in there. So we would see in the reminders module, again, a classes of inventory expiry reminders. So we're going to see, here's a list of all the different, when different inventory items are going to expire. I can also use the search function in the inventory module to search by expiry date. So I can say, show me any inventory item that has an expiry date of this year. And once I get that information, I can say, spit it out into an expiry date report. And that's going to quickly show me specifically when all the items in my current search are going to be expiring. So this can be a handy way to see, like, this expiry date search can also be run for the future. That's kind of when it tends to be helpful. Run it for next year before budgeting time, and you can have a more detailed body of reports that are going to say, when are these particular pieces of gear going to be expired. It's not loving me just at the moment. Turns out, yeah. Okay. So we can see, here is the expiry date for all the gear that's in this particular classes that I want. Again, broken down by category, subcategory, and inventory name, showing you a breakdown of all this stuff that's going to expire in that time period. There's also information that you can have on an inventory item that relates to cost of the item. So for example, if I put in the purchase cost here, it's going to give me total value. This is going to be useful because there's some inventory value reports, which you can generate as well, which will give you total purchase cost for your item. FirePro also has a built-in depreciation and estimated replacement cost calculator in this replacement information section. So there is a standard algorithm that's in the back of FirePro, which you can actually modify if you want to. That's done through the inventory section of the custom settings. We can see there's the depreciated value and replacement cost fields, which lets you customize how that figures its estimates. But that is actually going to let you quickly see on a piece of gear if you have put in a cost, estimated depreciated value, and replacement cost. This information then also flows into another report. One of the things you can do that deals with that report as well is if you have gear that you're pretty confident you're going to be replacing and you know what it's going to cost different from the calculated cost, you can just put that in here. If you want to put in a date that you updated it, you can. And this information will then flow over, and I will pick a smaller body of records here, to a report which is called the inventory accounting report. I will often run this in conjunction with something like a search by inventory expiry, but I can say, show me an inventory accounting report. That's going to give me a quick breakdown. Again, this report has to crunch a few numbers in terms of generating estimated replacement costs and things like that. And again, this is just a standard calculation based on purchase date and purchase cost, but it will spit out an organized report for me that's going to show me a detailed breakdown of all the gear that I've selected, and then information that might be related to the accounting side of things. So there we go. So we can see on here, it's going to give us the items that we're looking at, when they were purchased, how many we have, how much they cost, their expected date, replacement date, depreciated value, and estimated calculated replacement costs. Again, not designed to do all the work for you, but can be a really helpful way to get you a starting point for some of the accounting or replacement information that you want to generate. There is also a more generic report in here, which is our inventory value summary report. This is, for many departments, this has been designed to just give you a report that quickly spits out, what is my inventory worth? And I probably should have done this for less than 2,700 items, but you tend to do this at a big scale. So it's going to show you all your gear broken down by station and location, and total value, as well as the actual estimated depreciated value, if you want. So this report can be quite handy if you are, knowing you're going to need to do things like insurance or providing a report every year to the municipality in terms of total value. Reports like this, if they're something that you really need to do on a regular basis, they tend to be the only reasons that I recommend putting a lot of what I would think of as non-serviceable or non-detailed gear in the inventory module, because a lot of the rest of the time, those don't have a hugely beneficial application in inventory. But this report certainly can generate a very detailed breakdown of what your gear is worth. Okay, so lots of options for tracking things like expiry and gear value. When we get into, I want to dig into apparatuses a little more now and talk about some of the options that we have there. So when I am dealing with apparatus records, I have a little more information on them than on standard inventory items. We saw already we can have things like make, model, and VIN number. We can also have mileage logs on these pieces of gear. Another thing that you can do on apparatuses is that you can flag them as being monitor driving. So if you turn on the driving monitoring for an apparatus, you have a couple choices about how you might want to monitor the driving. So one is that you can set a reminder period, say 365 days. If you do that, then if someone has not driven this apparatus in a year, then you'll get a reminder for it. And those reminders can either be department-wide for everybody who's flagged to monitor driving, or they can be tied to station. What station are you attached to? If you just leave this blank, it'll let you track driving, but won't generate specific reminders for individuals. It just lets you generate a driving history. If you turn on the driving monitoring, then you do also have to turn on an individual person basis in their custom tab. Do you want to monitor driving for this person? And it'll show you in this case, the apparatuses that are assigned to their station that it's going to monitor. This will then let you track driving on incident reports and in training and daily log activities to monitor what times people have driven and how long they've driven for. And this will then flow back to their personnel records, where you can quickly generate things like driving logs that's going to show specific time periods or different apparatuses that we're going to quickly see all the times this person has driven, and when they drove, how long they drove for, if you're documenting that. So the apparatuses can have those detailed driving logs attached to them. Apparatus can also automatically give you that list of incident histories or daily log histories that we were looking at earlier. There is also the ability on apparatuses, and this is more important in various different provinces, but you can have specific invoicing rates attached to apparatus. And the way that these invoicing rates are calculated, the time intervals and things, these are all configurable in FirePro. So this is something that you can customize, but you can actually have multiple different invoicing rates for various different apparatuses. You can just add the rates it's going to give you a breakdown of the rate. If you're in the province of Alberta and you're doing fire call and rescue forms, the invoice rate that's flagged as default is the one that the fire call and rescue form will use for this apparatus by default. But if you're using the associated invoicing module, that's an optional one, then you can actually generate invoices with toggleable rates. And the system will automatically calculate invoicing cost based on the rules that you set up and the rates that you set up in. And we'll probably spend more time on that when I do a detailed dive into the invoicing tool. But if you need more help setting that up, just contact technical support and we can get you going on that. So invoicing rates are something that you can associate with your apparatuses. Now, another class of item that we've talked briefly about how to do, but getting in a little more detail for, is that we can assign gear to the linking type of personnel. That means this is a piece of equipment that is going to be assigned potentially to personnel records. Once I assign something to linking type personnel, there's two different ways for me to assign it to a particular person. One is that I can go into the Assigned To tab and just create a new assignment, attach it to a personnel record, and expand that. We can see down at the bottom of the screen, there's going to be information about the assignment details. So when it was assigned, potentially cost of item. But one of the other nice things here is that if you want to, you can identify that specific pieces of gear are due back at a time. I see this happen a lot if people are doing like department iPads with training information or textbooks, if they're bringing them home, you can put in a due back date. And again, this will generate an inventory due back reminder for you that will pop up in the reminders queue to identify that. What also happens is that if a piece of gear is not going to be assigned to someone anymore, you can flag them as unassigned here, which will maintain a history of all the people that have had that equipment, but not have it actively assigned to this person anymore. If you retire a personnel record that has equipment attached to it, the software will automatically prompt you. Do you want to unassign all the gear? And if you say yes, it'll do that based on their department retirement date. You can also print logs of gear that is assigned to an individual person right from their personnel records. So if I wanted to do it at a group, I can go into the other details section and I can generate an inventory assigned detail or inventory assigned summary report, which is going to give me a detailed breakdown of all the gear that's assigned to these people. Right? The person, categories of gear, all the equipment. This is the detailed one, so it's got a lot of information on it. But you can also have a more of a lighter version of that with the assigned summary. It's just going to quickly show you each person and what gear they currently have assigned to them. So that can be useful. You can also see that information directly on someone's personnel record in the employment tab. There's a log of the inventory that's assigned to them currently. And this, from this place, you can also add inventory to a person. Usually depends on whether you've already got the inventory all entered and you're just assigning it out. It's easier to do that from the personnel record. If you're creating inventory to assign to a person, it's usually easier to assign it right from the inventory records. So this lets you track the history of all the gear that's assigned to an individual person. So that stuff is all in there, and we can see there are, in the reminders module, there is an inventory assigned to due back reminder. This might not have it, but yeah, they have put in it. So nothing that we'll see there. There is also a final class of inventory reminders that you can generate, and this is done through the warranty tab. So in the warranty tab, I can build different warranties that a piece of equipment might have. I can put in the date that that warranty is expiring. And then I can put in some more notes on that. And once again, this will generate a manufacturer's warranty expiry reminder for me to indicate that there's a warranty expiring that I'm going to deal with something on. It's usually nice to make sure that those get generated a bit. Those are generally generated a bit in advance of when the warranties actually expire. So that we've covered most of the standard features of inventory and the standard linking types. I've also gone through a bunch of the different reports, although there are a few more dealing with things like inventory pictures or rosters for driving, things like that. But that really does cover the vast majority. And I did manage to keep it to under an hour, but only by a little. So at this point, the main body of the presentation is done. Shortly, I'm going to stop recording, but if people have questions that they want to ask, then please feel free to stay on and ask any questions.